heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 167, covering the week of April 29th through May 3rd, 2019. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Abbeville Institute, like our Facebook page at Abbeville Institute, and of course, subscribe to our YouTube page at Abbeville Institute. You can find all those social media buttons at the top of our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. While you're there, give us an email address and we'll give you a free ebook. And of course, you'll get our daily dose of Dixie Monday through Friday when you do that, and our weekly email on Saturday or Sunday, which includes a link to this podcast. Also, if you'd like to get this podcast, you can go and download our mobile app. Just go to your app store, look for Abbeville Institute. And of course, you can pick up the podcast that way. It's a great way to stay in touch and keep up with our lectures, our podcasts, and other articles on the go. So it is free of charge. You can get that application through your favorite app store. And if you do like the podcast, I want to mention this. If you do like the podcast, rate it on Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to it, because the more reviews, the better. So if you like it, rate it. Also, you can support the Abbeville Institute by going to abbevilleinstitute.org. At the top of the page, you'll see a button that says support. You click on that and you'll have donor options. And under donor options, you have a multitude of different ways to donate. You can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time donation. And of course, all of that is tax deductible to the full extent of the law. So please consider a donation. We exist on your generous contributions alone. There's also ways to donate through planned and endowment giving. So you can look at that as well. You can also get our Abbeville Institute apparel. That's a great way to support the Institute. It's advertisement, and of course, it's great stuff. It is embroidered apparel, so it's not screen printed. This stuff lasts forever, right? So you want to get your embroidered apparel. We got hats, shirts, fleece, golf towels, a lot of great stuff. So it's a great way to support the Institute. You can also click on our little Amazon Smile button at the top of the page, too. You can support the Institute every time you shop at Amazon. You get, every time you purchase something, we get a little change off of that. So it's a way to support the Institute as well. We are part of the Amazon Smile program. So if you do shop at Amazon, consider using the Amazon Smile button and make us your preferred nonprofit when you shop at Amazon. It's a great way to support the Institute, and you do it passively. You just do it by shopping. So it's wonderful. All right, all of that said, let's talk about the material for the week, and I think we had some really interesting pieces this week. First and foremost, April, of course, was Confederate Heritage Month, and so we didn't really talk about that a lot. The Southern tradition is bigger than just the 4 years of the war. It's 400 years of history, and so we focus on the war in some articles, and because it's a pressing issue, people see it. It's in their face all the time now because of the attack on Confederate monuments and statues. It's not just though Confederate monuments and statues that are under attack. It's other things which we'll get into this week as well. But we do support Confederate Heritage Month. It's part of Southern history. And so the piece we ran on Monday was Alan Tate's Ode to the Confederate Dead. And we have to understand, and I'm not going to read the poem. We actually, not only did we have the poem that we republished, but also Alan Tate himself reading the poem in a YouTube video that's there as well. So you can hear how Alan Tate wanted the poem to be read. I mean, that's wonderful. We did this with Davidson's Lee in the Mountains. If you go out and look at our YouTube page, we have it on there. Davidson reading Lee in the Mountains, which is a fantastic poem. But of course, both Davidson and Alan Tate were part of the Nashville Agrarians and the Fugitive Agrarians. And Tate was actually Poet Laureate of the United States in the 1940s, which makes it even more impressive. Now, I can guarantee you that when you took your American literature course, you didn't read any Alan Tate. And that's because Alan Tate, because of his non-PC views or views that are not in step with contemporary views on American society, is essentially blacklisted from your mainstream literature textbooks. But here's a man who was Poet Laureate of the United States, just like Robert Frost was Poet Laureate of the United States. And Alan Tate was Poet Laureate of the United States in part because of this poem. It's considered one of the best poems of the mid-20th century. And it's an update on Timrod's Ode to the Confederate Dead at Magnolia Cemetery in the 1860s. So, of course, Timrod was made famous not long ago because of Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan actually took Timrod's poetry and made an album out of it, essentially. So here's Bob Dylan, the hippie folk artist, taking Southern poetry, which is really good stuff, and essentially crafting an album out of it. So that's an amazing testament to the lasting power of Southern poetry. And this poem is beautiful. If you have never read it before, I highly recommend it. And of course, it was fitting because it is Confederate Memorial Month, or April was. And so this poem speaks to that. It speaks to the sacrifice of the Confederate soldier. It speaks to the mourning of the South, both immediately after the war and then later on into the 20th century, and what was lost. And so when people, the funny thing is, when people say it's a lost cause, and they use that as pejorative, they say this because perhaps in their lifetime, no one that they knew was ever suffered because of the war. And it was always seen in the South that the war created great suffering. And so when you go through that kind of suffering, you're going to have some type of communal understanding of that particular process. And so that became the postbellum South. And I think that's important to understand. People that are use that term, well, this is lost causes. We had some moron on our Facebook page do that. Well, the Abbeville Institute should be called the Institute for the Lost Cause. I wonder how long it took him to come up with that. Right? Did he come up with that on his own? Did he have to look that up? This is the stuff that we get. No, we're the Institute of the Southern Tradition, which is part of that cause. So people that say these things have no conception. It's actually evil to critique Southerners for wanting to fondly remember their ancestors. It's evil to do that. And we don't look at that, but it's actually evil. You're saying that you cannot respect your patrimony, that those people were wrong and evil, and so you cannot respect them. But these are subjective terms, and of course, as we saw on Tuesday's piece, which is The Real Cause by Kirk Wood, it's a review of James McPherson, who by no means is a, quote, neo-Confederate. He is one of the establishment historians when it comes to the war. His battle cry of freedom is still assigned in college classrooms across the country as one of the definitive texts on the war itself. And so James McPherson, back in the 90s, wrote a book entitled For Cause and Comrades. And in this particular book, he went out and he reviewed hundreds of thousands of letters from Union and Confederate soldiers. And his conclusion is that, guess what? The Southern soldier was not fighting for slavery. It's something that, quote-unquote, lost causers have been saying for generations. But his conclusion was that, well, I guess I have to admit that Southern soldiers were not fighting for slavery. In fact, they were fighting against slavery, in his words. In James McPherson's words, they were fighting against their own slavery, what they considered to be slavery. Now, he does say, well, look, there were Southern soldiers who were fighting for slavery, and I don't think anyone with half a brain would deny that there were some that were doing that. Just like he would also say that Northerners were not fighting against slavery. Most of them. Some of them were going out in a moral crusade to end slavery, but most were not. They were fighting for the Union, for the preservation of the Union, whatever that means. Some metaphysical civic religion is what they were doing. Both sides were fighting for the founding fathers, for the founding principles, for the Declaration of Independence. This is what Southerners were fighting for. It's what Northerners thought they were fighting for. This is why they could bury the hatchet once the war was over, because those were the principles upon which they contended. Not some moral crusade. Now, Union soldiers, of course, in 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, There were mass desertions in the Union Army because of that. You did see, as he says, well, there was a kind of acceptance in the Union Army that this became a war aimed to end slavery. But that took place 2 years after the war began. When Union soldiers marched off to war in 1861, they were going to war to save the Union, not to free any slaves. And you had slave owners that were pro-Union. In fact, I always love this story. One of the most pro-Union men in Columbus, Georgia, his name was Randolph Mott. Randolph Mott never supported the war, never supported the secession of Georgia. And when the Union Army moved through Columbus, Georgia in April of 1865, in the last major battle east of the Mississippi, April 16th, 1865, they used his house as headquarters. It was on the Chattahoochee River. He owned about 2 acres right on the river. He was a slave owner. He, in fact, was one of the larger slave owners in the city of Columbus. And when James Harrison Wilson left Columbus, he, of course, by order, freed the slaves of Columbus. And Randolph Mott was incensed. He said, look, I supported you. You can't free my slaves. I'm a Union man. Right? So here's a Union man who's saying he supports the Union, but you can't free his slaves. So you had pro-Union slave owners who were incensed by what the Union was doing. And this was the case in the North and border southern states. We know that slavery didn't end, for example, in New Jersey until 1865, until the war was over. You still had slavery in New Jersey. So the fact is, this is a much more complex war than what the cartoonish version that you get from the righteous cause mythologists, which is what that is. It's a righteous cause myth, and they need that because if they don't have that, see, here's the thing. If there is no righteous cause, then the war becomes unholy and immoral because it's an invasion of another people for a metaphysical union, for territory and for a tariff. That's it. You see, if there's no righteous cause, if it's not going to war to end slavery from the beginning, then no one can justify this war. You can't. You can't justify slaughtering people over the maintenance of a union. It doesn't make any sense. So you have to come up with something else. Well, you have to have the evil Southerners who are fighting for slavery against the good Northerners who are fighting against slavery. This is the only way you can do it. It's the only way it makes sense. And it didn't make sense, even if you want to say, okay, the war aim 1863 became ending slavery. All right. But then what were you doing for 2 years before that? You weren't fighting to end slavery, so the entire premise of the war was, in fact, immoral from the beginning. So if you want to say, well, in 1863 it became a moral crusade, okay. But then what was going on for 2 years before that? In fact, some of the most important battles of the war took place before that. So before that, I mean, what was it? A war of occupation? A war for union, which is what it was from the beginning. In fact, Lincoln, we know for a fact Lincoln in 1865, in January of 1865, was willing to put off emancipation if the South would just come back in the Union. We know this for a fact. We'll put it off. He told Alexander H. Stephens this, and Paul Escott, who wrote a wonderful book on this, and he's, again, by no means a quote-unquote neo-Confederate. He's saying, look, here's the case. I believe that Lincoln was willing to do this. He was willing to put it off for 20 years. If the South would simply stop fighting, they could come back in the Union. We'll put off emancipation. That's because Lincoln wanted to forge a conservative party. He wanted to ensure that would be made up of conservative Southerners, or you could say moderate Southerners, and conservative Northerners, and alienate the radicals of each side. Lincoln essentially was a Whig, and that's what he viewed the Whig Party as. It was a conservative party, and the radicals were the abolitionists and, of course, the secessionists. And so we're going to create a party that's going to alienate both those sides, and we're going to run the government, and we're going to have a Whig government, essentially. We're going to bring men like Alexander H. Stephens back into the party. We're going to have this party, and it's going to be a good party because we're going to unify on the things that we can agree on. But, of course, that didn't happen. Lincoln was assassinated. The South refused to come back in the Union on those terms. I mean, they could have come back in the Union. Look, we'll just put it off. Jefferson Davis said, no, it's unconditional. Independence is unconditional. And of course, at this point, in 1865, Davis had already made overtures that he was willing to end slavery in the South. This is the Kenner Mission. He had sent a man named Kenner off to Europe to try to persuade the British or the French to come in on the side of the South under the promise that the South would end slavery. He was already willing to do it. So it was independence, unconditional independence. There was no condition to coming back. Independence had to be recognized. You want to end the war, you have to say the South is going to be independent. And Davis said that from the beginning. He said in 1861, look, we don't want war. We just want to be left alone. Now, take that. I mean, people can say, the South started the war. Jefferson Davis is saying, when he's inaugurated as president, we don't want war. We don't want war. Just leave us alone. Let us govern ourselves. That's an American principle. So those that say that, these Southerners were committing treason. Self-government is treason. Abraham Lincoln said as much that it wasn't. In 1848, when he made a speech on the Mexican War, the war with Mexico, he said, look, any people anywhere can have self-determination. That's a fundamental American principle. And you don't have to have the permission of the majority. You can do it if you're the minority. You can have self-determination. Any people anywhere. Well, as president, he didn't follow through on that. So he was able to put that to the test, and he didn't do it. He failed at what he said was his defining principle. So I think that book, look, James McPherson, again, no neo-Confederate. Gary Gallagher's The Confederate War, same thing. Gary Gallagher, no neo-Confederate. In fact, he has to apologize at the beginning of the book for saying, some people might take this to say that I'm going to support the neo-Confederate side, but, the evidence kind of supports that. I'm not a neo-Confederate, don't call me that. And of course, he had to follow up with the Union War, where essentially he had to backtrack on some of those things. But Gallagher's The Confederate War, and Gary Gallagher, again, one of the foremost establishment war historians, is saying essentially the things that quote-unquote neo-Confederates have been saying for years. So it's he basically says, look, no people in America has ever suffered the way no American group has ever suffered the way Southerners did. No American group. So I think that's important to understanding this quote-unquote lost cause and why when people run around, because it's simply groupthink now. We're in groupthink mode. Well, this is what people say it is, so this is what it is. It's treason. It's these people are traitors. Well, okay, show me where in the Constitution that it says Southerners were traitors. Show me. Show me where it says secession is illegal. Show me. And they can't. Show me where it says that self-determination is not an American principle. Show me where Abraham Lincoln actually said, as a congressman, that secession was illegal. He didn't. He said it was a right. He's called it a right of revolution, but it was a right. And so the argument then comes back, well, the South lost, so then it was treason. If the South won, it wasn't treason. No, it's either treason or it's not from the beginning. So now you have a war of occupation, a war of subjugation. And if that's the case, then the war is immoral. The only thing to save that is this righteous cause mythology. Well, we were going to fight to free the slaves. Lincoln decided we're fighting to free the slaves. We're going to make slavery a war aim. Well, the British did the exact same thing in 1776. The British decided that ending slavery would be a war aim in the American War for Independence. But yet, do we go back? And of course, we had 13 slaveholding states at that point. So do we go back and say, well, that war was about slavery? No, we don't, because it would be inconsistent. Of course, there were men who were afraid that the British would end slavery should they lose the war. And so they were concerned about that. They openly said it. But does that make the war about slavery? No, it makes the war about independence. Just like this war for the South was a war for Southern independence. As Eugene Genovese, who was a Marxist most of his life, highly critical of the South at times, but of course accepting of the Southern tradition and believed there was something valuable in it, would say, he even said, it's a war for Southern independence. It's exactly what it is. And to say otherwise is to distort the entire period. So I love this book. If you're going to read a book on the war, and he's very open about North and South, and There's perspective there. Some Northerners were fighting against slavery. Some Southerners are fighting for slavery, but the majority of soldiers are fighting against slavery for the South, meaning their own enslavement. And the majority of Northerners were fighting for the Union, and they were all fighting for their view of republicanism or liberty or the Constitution or the Declaration. I mean, there's all these things. But again, as Lee said in September of 1861, to a man, Southerners are fighting for hearth and home against their own enslavement by the North. That's it. You want to find out what Southerners are fighting for? That's it. That's what Lee was fighting for. And this is why Lee was considered a great American. So we have that. Now, speaking of Lee, we did have a terrible loss on Easter Sunday, and I mentioned that in a previous podcast. But we ran a piece by Boyd Cathy on Aaron Woolf. Aaron Woolf was the executive editor of Chronicles magazine, and he suffered, as a young man, 45, suffered a heart attack, massive heart attack, and died on Easter Sunday. Of course, Woolf was a devout Christian, so in some ways it's fitting that he dies on the day of the resurrection. But he was a staunch defender of the Southern tradition. One of his last public speeches was at an Abbeville Institute event in 2018, where he gave a talk on Robert E. Lee and what he called on the feeling of loyalty, because he understood that one of the things that Lee represented most was loyalty. And you can say, how can you say that? He's a traitor. He's not loyal. He was loyal. He was loyal to his family. He was loyal to his patrimony. He was loyal to his state, which his state had protected him and his family for generations. His father, of course, was George Washington's right-hand man, Light Horse Harry Lee. This is a man that respected Virginia, respected his family. Now, of course, you have the prior argument, well, but there are other Lees that stayed with the Union. This is true. There were, and there were other Lees that didn't think that this was the case. This is true. That, going against the Union was going against their patrimony. That Lee's father would have been spinning in his grave at this independence of the South. Maybe, we don't know what George Washington or Lee would have said about it. It's just speculation. Southerners believe that, of course, Washington would have supported it. It's a right of revolution. And we know that many of the descendants of the founders from Virginia and other states, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland. We know that descendants of those founding generation fought for the Confederacy, or served in the Confederate government, so that's what they thought about it. I mean, Lee himself, a descendant from a Revolutionary War hero, right? So we know what they thought about it. But this is important. And if you don't read Chronicles, if you're a conservative, a paleo-conservative, it's a great magazine. Clyde Wilson wrote for it for years, and I've written an article there. Several other contributors to the Abbeville Institute site have written articles there. It's a wonderful conservative magazine and a magazine of American culture. Tom Fleming, who's presented several times at Abbeville Institute events, was the executive editor for years. So, and of course, the Fleming Foundation is now his organization. And we published material from Tom Fleming on the Abbeville website. So it's a great organization, and one that you should read, and you should read the Chronicles magazine. But Aaron Woolf was certainly part of that, and part of this Southern tradition. He was just a giant of a man, a great Christian, a great Southerner, and so he will be missed. And there is a GoFundMe page set up for Aaron Woolf. If you go to that article on the website, written by Boyd, by Dr. Cathy, there is a link to the GoFundMe in that article. And so if you'd like to contribute, Aaron was also a husband, father. He had 6 children, one with special needs, actually 2 with special needs. And they were a homeschooling family. So his wife does not work, and she's a homeschooling mother. And so there is some financial strain, of course, because of that. And so if you'd like to contribute and help out their family in whatever way you can, even $5, $1, anything would go to helping that family out in their time of need. And it's a really sad story. Now, The Thursday piece was written by yours truly, and it's entitled God Bless America. If you haven't seen the news, of course, Kate Smith, who was the most famous, most conspicuous artist to perform that song, had a statue in Philadelphia in front of the one of the athletic venues there, the Philadelphia Flyers athletic venue, Philadelphia Flyers being a hockey team. And in the 1970s, Kate Smith famously performed God Bless America at one of the Stanley Cup events there, and the Flyers were in the Stanley Cup Finals, and they won the Stanley Cup. And so from then on out, they used her version of that song as an inspiration. Hey, look, we're going to keep playing Kate Smith, God Bless America, because that helped us win the Stanley Cup. Well, lo and behold, and of course, after September 11, 2001, the Yankees, the New York Yankees, would use her version of God Bless America during the seventh inning stretch. Used to be, take me out to the ball game, but then they decided after September 11th attacks they're going to use God Bless America, and they used primarily Kate Smith's version. They used others too, but they decided to use her version, and then they started doing a rotation of different people singing the song, but hers was always the standard. If you think of God Bless America, you think of Kate Smith. Well, that can't happen anymore because somebody went out and dug up the fact that she had performed a couple of songs in the 1940s that would not be considered to be good songs today. And that she actually had she was in a commercial in the 1940s for what was called a mammy doll. And so now, nope, Kate Smith is persona non grata. She had a statue of her performing the song there in Philadelphia. That had been bagged and removed. We can't do this. We can't have that song, all because Kate Smith was from Virginia, and so she had to be a racist because she sang these songs. And forget about the fact that African Americans also performed the songs in question that were considered to be racist. And African Americans, as I point out in the piece, like Louis Armstrong, when it's a sleepy time down south, people would watch the music video, which I put in the piece, and say, oh my gosh, that's very, very racist. It's all African American actors. All African American actors. Written by African Americans. And so, are they all racist? I mean, this is how stupid this stuff is getting. It's stupid. That's the only way to describe it. Just stupid. So we now can no longer enjoy Kate Smith's God Bless America because somebody said that it's offensive. Somebody somewhere decided that, oh my gosh, she sang a song 70 years ago that we wouldn't perform today. So now Kate Smith has to go. We can't have her God Bless America. I mean, forget about the fact it's the most famous version out there. But no, we can't play that anymore because she sang a song that we don't think is sensitive enough. It's insensitive. We can't do that. And of course, it was just a knee-jerk reaction from these stupid New York. I mean, look, it's the New York Yankees, right? I mean, how much more stupid can you get? And then the Flyers, we're just going to take that statue down. So it's not just Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis. We're going to take down anything that might be offensive. And we've been warning about this. Look, it's not the Confederate statues. That's all low-hanging fruit. They're going to come down. That's easy. We're just going to say we're going to now, of course, the judges said you can't take down Lee and Jackson in Virginia because they are war memorials and the state law protects them. So these state laws are going to be a hindrance to this stuff. But the attack on those is easy. Kate Smith, and it should have been harder, but no, it's not because she sang a song that we would consider to be insensitive, so she's got to go. What about Thomas Jefferson? What about George Washington? What about Abraham Lincoln, who said all kinds of racist things? Why should we have a statue to Abraham Lincoln? It celebrates racism. Why should we do that? But of course, this is where we are now, right? So it's coming. It's coming. And I think that the stupidity over the Kate Smith situation is indicative of what's coming in the future. So just buckle your seatbelts because this is where the SJWs are going. And they won't stop unless good people start saying, you're stupid, be quiet, and get over it. And that's the only way to respond to it. So that piece covers the Kate Smith situation. Then in many ways, we wrapped up the week with a piece by Tom Landis, and I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but there's a wonderful metaphor used. It's about Richard Weaver. He wrote this piece 20 years after Richard Weaver's death in the 1980s. 1983, I think he published this piece, and of course, Tom Landis is no longer with us either. But he talks about how Weaver, he actually attended a lecture by Richard Weaver. And Weaver was trying to make this lecture, and there was construction going on outside, and they were bulldozing a building at Vanderbilt. And he said, as the lecture ended, we walked outside, and this building had been bulldozed. It was symbolic of what Weaver was actually talking about. Just bulldoze it down and you have the rubble. And this is what the Southern tradition is going through. It's just bulldoze it down. All we have left is the rubble. And Weaver was fighting against that. He was trying to call attention to the fact that the Southern tradition offered something that should not be bulldozed. These statues, these memorials offer something that should not be bulldozed. God Bless America is being bulldozed because you have a bunch of sensitive SJW saying, oh my gosh, she's saying something that was offensive to me. I can't handle that. Oh! And they go through, some type of convulsions. I mean, where are we as a people? It's ridiculous. It really is ridiculous. You almost can't parody it, but, I mean, people used to parody it. They used to make fun of it. Now you can't. Because it's become reality. And Weaver was pointing out in the 1960s what's under attack. And here we are in the 1980s, and it's only gotten worse, and now we are with Landis's piece, and now we are 30 years after that, and it's only gotten even worse from that. So this is why the Institute exists, and if you want to help us, contribute financially to it, we exist because of the Southern tradition needs a defense. You have people in other organizations go out and they'll just talk about the Southern tradition, how important it was, but we're the only organization. The Abbeville Institute is the only organization that is focused exclusively on what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. And that Southern tradition includes people like Alan Tate and Richard Weaver. It includes Kate Smith, because she was from Virginia. She was the songbird of the South. It includes Aaron Woolf. It includes these things. It includes Robert E. Lee. It includes Thomas Jefferson. It includes John Smith and Pocahontas. That's the Southern tradition. It includes Booker T. Washington. That's the Southern tradition. It includes all of those people who made the Southern tradition what it was, an understanding of it, what's true and valuable in it. And so we invite you to support us, to read these articles, to listen to this podcast, to share it around, because this is the only way that we can preserve what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition and explore it together. Until next time, good day.